On the 26th of June, 1944, at Hollandia Air Base in Dutch New Guinea, a checkers game remained suspended in time as Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald glanced up from the contested board. A man had just announced himself at the screen door, yet the name failed to anchor itself in MacDonald's mind. His focus instead locked on the strategic duel with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, the operations officer for Satan's Angels. With a quiet confidence that demanded attention, the civilian repeated his introduction, compelling MacDonald to finally pause. Charles Lindbergh. Yes, the Charles Lindbergh, America's most celebrated aviator, was standing right there in a makeshift recreation hall, thousands of miles from the familiar comforts of home, requesting to discuss the combat operations of the P-38. In that fleeting moment, neither man could possibly fathom that this simple interruption was the dawn of a revolution, a paradigm shift for long-range fighter missions across the vast Pacific theater. The very techniques Lindbergh was about to impart over the subsequent 6 weeks would astonishingly extend the combat radius of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning by nearly 400 miles, miraculously transforming what pilots had dismissed as impossible into their new standard operating procedure. The tale of how a civilian consultant managed to double the effective range of America's premier twin-engine fighter is far more than a dry technical account. It is a compelling narrative of overcoming deep-seated institutional resistance with the sheer force of irrefutable evidence. A story of pilots learning to place their faith in cold mathematics over gut instinct, and of one man's singular mastery of fuel efficiency forever altering the course of aerial warfare in the Pacific. The intricate mathematics of this extended range were not being drafted in sterile engineering manuals, but were instead being written in the sky, etched into the daily experiences of pilots, who would soon discover that everything they had ever been taught about engine management was fundamentally incomplete. The impossible was on the very brink of becoming routine, and the man who would teach them was a 42-year-old civilian who, until just 3 days prior, had never even sat in the cockpit of a P-38. The long journey that led to that screen door in Hollandia truly began 17 years earlier, high above the churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Between May 20th and 21st, 1927, Charles Augustus Lindbergh had forever reshaped the world of aviation by soaring 3,600 miles from New York to Paris, alone in a grueling 33.5 hours. The Ryan NYP monoplane he commanded, the legendary Spirit of St. Louis, was burdened with 450 gallons of fuel in tanks so immense they completely obstructed his forward view. Lindbergh had navigated this historic flight using only a periscope and dead reckoning, managing his fuel consumption with a level of precision that would have seemed utterly paranoid to his contemporaries. He touched down at Le Bourget Field with a remarkable 85 gallons still in his tanks, having achieved a fuel economy that experts had previously deemed impossible for a Wright Whirlwind radial engine. That obsessive, meticulous attention to fuel management became the cornerstone of Lindbergh's defining technical expertise. Throughout the 1930s, as he meticulously conducted survey flights for Pan American Airways, charting routes across the Pacific and Atlantic, Lindbergh continued to refine these techniques, pushing aircraft range far beyond the manufacturer's official specifications. He possessed a profound understanding that the published range figures were merely averages, not absolute limits. Every single engine, he knew, had an optimal operating envelope, a perfect sweet spot where power output, fuel consumption, and mechanical stress achieved a flawless, harmonious balance. Discovering that envelope demanded a nuanced comprehension of the intricate relationship between manifold pressure, propeller RPM, mixture settings, and indicated airspeed, in ways that went light years beyond standard pilot training. By 1944, Lindbergh had solidified his reputation as one of the world's preeminent experts on long-range flight. Yet his relationship with the United States military was fraught with complication. Soured by his outspoken pre-war isolationism, he had argued with fervent passion against American intervention in the conflicts brewing in Europe, famously leading the America First Committee and, in doing so, earning the deep-seated enmity of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. On April 29, 1941, After Roosevelt publicly likened him to the Civil War Confederate sympathizer Clement Vallandigham, a deeply insulted Lindbergh resigned his Army Air Corps Reserve Colonel's commission. When the attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America into the global war, Lindbergh attempted to rejoin the Army Air Corps, but Roosevelt personally intervened, ensuring Lindbergh would not wear an American military uniform again for the duration of the war. But true expertise will always find a way to be of service. Barred from serving as a military officer, Lindbergh transitioned into a role as a civilian technical consultant for the nation's leading aircraft manufacturers. He joined the United Aircraft Corporation in 1943, working extensively with their Chance Vought division, the producers of the formidable F-4U Corsair. He spent invaluable time at Ford's massive Willow Run plant, troubleshooting persistent production problems with the B-24 Liberator. He courageously flew dangerous high-altitude test flights in P-47 Thunderbolts, meticulously analyzing engine performance. He even helped develop innovative dive-bombing techniques for the Corsair. His technical contributions were undeniably enormous, yet Lindbergh harbored a deep, burning hunger for combat. By early 1944, he saw his chance. United Aircraft was keen to study the feasibility of a new twin-engine fighter, and the only American aircraft in that category was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Lindbergh masterfully convinced United Aircraft to dispatch him to the Pacific Theater as a technical representative, his mission being to observe P-38 operations under the crucible of real combat conditions. On April 3, 1944, Lindbergh began his preparations for deployment to the South Pacific. He paid a visit to Brooks Brothers in New York City, where he purchased a naval officer's uniform, stripped of all insignia. At Brentano's bookstore, he acquired a small New Testament, penning a note in his journal that day. "Since I can only carry one book, and a very small one, that is my choice. It would not have been a decade ago, but the more I learn and the more I read, the less competition it has." He departed from San Diego on April 24th. His official destination being the Marine Corps aviation bases in the South Pacific area, around the battle-scarred island of Guadalcanal. The Navy Department had authorized the trip, but it was kept a closely guarded secret from the White House. Neither President Roosevelt nor even Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had any idea Lindbergh was heading into an active war zone. What had started as a simple observation assignment soon morphed into something far more significant when Marine Corps aviation officers, recognizing his talent, invited Lindbergh to fly as an observer on their combat missions. On May 21, 1944, Lindbergh flew his first combat sortie, a harrowing strafing run with Marine Fighting Squadron 222 near the heavily fortified Japanese garrison at Rabaul. The Marines might have officially labeled it observation, but Lindbergh flew with his guns charged and hot, engaging enemy targets whenever the opportunity arose. He rapidly demonstrated a practical expertise that transcended mere theory. Working closely with the Corsair pilots, he showed them how to safely take off with bomb loads that were double the F-4U's rated capacity. The Marines had been tragically losing aircraft to accidents caused by being overweight, but Lindbergh's careful analysis of power settings, takeoff speeds, and weight distribution dramatically reduced these accidents while simultaneously increasing their strike capability. Word began to ripple through the Pacific Theater. The famous aviator was flying combat missions as a civilian and solving complex operational problems that had stumped seasoned military pilots for months. By mid-June of 1944, Lindbergh's focus had shifted to the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft's interest in twin-engine fighters was certainly genuine, but Lindbergh had also heard whispers that the 475th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels, was one of the most formidable Lightning outfits in the entire Pacific. He reasoned that if he truly wanted to learn about the P-38, that was the place to be. On June 15, 1944, Lindbergh hitched a ride on a flight to Finschhafen, New Guinea. He made his presence known to 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nadzab, where he had lunch with Colonel Marion Cooper. On the evening of Sunday, June 18th, Lindbergh dined with General Ennis Whitehead, discussing developments in New Guinea and outlining his plans to observe P-38 operations. The authorization he received was informal, entirely unofficial, and woefully insufficient by strict military standards. Yet within the fluid command structure of the Southwest Pacific Theater, personal connections and demonstrated competence often carried more weight than official paperwork. On June 20th, Lindbergh spent an hour and 20 minutes getting checked out in a P-38 with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group. It was his very first time inside the cockpit of the distinctive twin-boom fighter. 6 days later, on June 26th, he flew to Hollandia and walked in on Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald's interrupted game of checkers. MacDonald, at just 29 years old, was already a decorated ace with 10 victories to his name. He commanded the 475th Fighter Group, a unit that had been activated in Australia on May 14, 1943, and had since carved out a reputation as one of the highest-scoring P-38 units in the theater. The group's 3 squadrons, the 431st, 402nd, and 403rd, flew the latest P-38J models, which featured improved intercoolers and additional fuel capacity. These Lightnings were the longest-range fighters in the Pacific, capable of undertaking missions that no other aircraft could even attempt. But even with their drop tanks, the P-38's operational radius remained frustratingly limited. Missions to distant targets left precious little fuel for combat maneuvering, and pilots frequently returned to base with their fuel gauges hovering at uncomfortably low levels. Several aircraft had already been lost when unexpected weather forced detours that their fuel capacity simply couldn't handle. MacDonald, his mind still on the game, initially dismissed Lindbergh with polite brevity. But when Lindbergh calmly explained that he had been sent by General Hutchinson, the 3rd Air Task Force commander, to specifically discuss P-38 combat operations, MacDonald's attention sharpened. After a brief but focused conversation, MacDonald asked Lindbergh if he would be interested in flying a mission the very next day. Lindbergh readily agreed. The mission was scheduled to launch at dawn. To avoid any transportation issues, MacDonald suggested Lindbergh stay at the 475th's camp rather than return to headquarters. As Lindbergh settled onto a spare cot, the news spread like wildfire through the unit. Charles Lindbergh was flying with Satan's angels. The reaction among the pilots was a mixture of awe and apprehension. Lieutenant John Purdy of the 433rd Squadron was thrilled at the prospect of meeting the legendary aviator. Others, however, remained skeptical. Some openly questioned whether a 42-year-old civilian, famous or not, could truly handle the brutal realities of modern aerial combat. Major Thomas Maguire, already a 15-victory ace who would end the war as America's second-highest-scoring fighter pilot with 38 confirmed kills, simply wanted to see what the old guy could do. On the morning of June 27, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for his inaugural P-38 combat mission. The weather was abysmal, with a steady rain falling at 0530 hours. By 10:30, when the flight finally roared into the air, conditions had thankfully improved. MacDonald led a formation of 4 aircraft towards Jeffman Island and Samat Airfield, regular targets for the 475th. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3, tucked tightly on Maguire's wing. The 4th aircraft was piloted by Merrill Smith, who was already an 8-victory ace. MacDonald watched as Lindbergh effortlessly slipped into a perfect formation on Maguire's wing. For someone who had only been checked out in the P-38 a few days earlier, his formation flying was absolutely flawless. The mission involved strafing an enemy barge in Kibus Bay. Lindbergh weaved his P-38 through a storm of anti-aircraft fire, his cannon and machine guns raking the target with deadly precision. The mission was a success, and all 4 aircraft returned to base unscathed. But it was what the crew chiefs discovered after they landed that would prove to be infinitely more significant than any single combat action. As the ground crews serviced Lindbergh's P-38 after several missions, a curious pattern began to emerge. His aircraft consistently returned with substantially more fuel remaining than any of the other pilots who had flown the exact same missions. After a grueling 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance mission on July 1st to enemy airstrips along the western shore of Gelvink Bay, Lindbergh landed with an incredible 210 gallons of fuel still in his tanks. In stark contrast, other pilots from that same mission returned with fuel gauges that were perilously close to empty. On July 3rd, the group escorted 16 B-25 bombers on a strike against Jeffman Island. Following the attack, the Lightnings went hunting for barges. Within an hour, 2 pilots reported their fuel was dwindling and were forced to break off for home. Lindbergh, however, continued the mission, his fuel gauges showing comfortable reserves. MacDonald couldn't ignore the discrepancy and swiftly called a meeting. Just 2 days after Lindbergh's arrival, the colonel gathered the 475th's pilots in their recreation hall. The facility was crude, with packed dirt floors under a palm-thatched roof, its furnishings consisting of a single ping-pong table and a few decks of cards. Under the harsh glare of unshaded light bulbs, MacDonald got straight to the point. He formally introduced Lindbergh, and then asked him to explain to the group how he consistently managed to return from missions with more fuel than any other pilot. What unfolded next would forever change P-38 operations throughout the entire Pacific theater. Lindbergh stood before the assembled pilots and calmly explained the cruise control techniques he had meticulously worked out for the Lightning. The standard operating procedure taught to all P-38 pilots dictated cruising at 2200 to 2400 RPM, with the mixture set to auto-rich. This setting provided good power and was considered safe for the engines, but it was also incredibly wasteful. Lindbergh explained that by drastically reducing the engine speed from the standard 2200 RPM all the way down to 1600 RPM, setting the fuel mixture to auto-lean instead of auto-rich, and slightly increasing the manifold pressure to compensate for the lower RPM, pilots could achieve a dramatic reduction in fuel consumption without any significant loss in effective cruise speed. The specific settings he recommended were 1600 RPM at 30 inches of mercury manifold pressure, with the mixture set to auto-lean and an indicated airspeed of 185 knots. These settings slashed fuel consumption to approximately 70 gallons per hour, achieving an astonishing 2.6 miles per gallon. When compared to the standard cruise settings that consumed significantly more fuel, the savings were simply enormous. Lindbergh confidently predicted that these techniques would stretch the Lightning's combat radius by an incredible 400 miles, making 9-hour missions possible. When he concluded his presentation half an hour later, a heavy silence fell over the room. The pilots were left to mull over several deeply uncomfortable thoughts. The very notion of a 9-hour flight did not sit well with men who already found 7-hour missions to be a punishing ordeal. The P-38 cockpit was notoriously cramped. Pilots sat on their parachutes, with an emergency raft and oar packed beneath that, and their survival suits were anything but comfortable. 7 hours in that cockpit was already pushing the limits of human endurance. 9 hours seemed utterly inconceivable. Even more troubling was Lindbergh's recommendation to run the engines at settings they had been specifically and repeatedly taught to avoid. The combination of low RPM and high manifold pressure was known as running over square. Military flight training had hammered into them that over-square operation would severely damage the engines. The resulting detonation, they were warned, would cause cylinder heads to overheat, leading to catastrophic engine failure. Pilots were taught that if manifold pressure exceeded RPM by more than a few inches, they risked blowing up their engines. And now, this civilian was calmly suggesting they should routinely operate their engines in a condition they had been warned was dangerously reckless. The skepticism in the room was a tangible thing. Several pilots exchanged wary glances. Some shook their heads in disbelief. One pilot openly branded Lindbergh's technique as dangerous. But MacDonald understood something crucial. Lindbergh was not speaking from a position of abstract theory. He had actually flown combat missions using these exact settings. His P-38 had not suffered any engine problems. His aircraft had returned time and time again with fuel reserves that provided an operational flexibility other pilots could only dream of. The colonel made a decision. He would put the technique to a practical test. If it worked, the 475th would gain a decisive operational advantage. If it failed, they would know soon enough. Over the course of the next week, the pilots began to cautiously experiment with Lindbergh's cruise settings. The initial flights were kept short, allowing them to return to base quickly if the engines showed any signs of distress. The first pilots to try the technique reported nervously that their engines sounded different at the lower RPM. The deep, familiar rumble of the Allison V1710 engines changed in character, but their temperature gauges remained reassuringly normal. Oil pressure stayed well within acceptable ranges. Most importantly, the cylinder head temperatures, the critical indicator of detonation, actually ran cooler than they did at the higher RPM settings. As their confidence grew, pilots started using Lindbergh's techniques on longer and longer missions. The fuel savings were undeniable. Missions that had previously required an immediate return to base after a target strike could now include an extended combat air patrol. Flights that had once forced pilots to carefully monitor every drop of fuel now ended with comfortable reserves. The P-38's effective combat radius, which had previously been about 570 miles, extended to 700 miles, and then to an incredible 750 miles. Pilots discovered they could now reach targets that had long been considered well beyond the Lightning's capability, fight for 15 minutes over the target area, and still return to base with a 1-hour fuel reserve. The transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. The initial skepticism evaporated as mission after mission proved the undeniable effectiveness of the technique. Lindbergh flew regularly with the 475th, accumulating combat hours and teaching by example. He led flights demonstrating that the civilian observer could handle combat just as well as any military pilot. On the missions he led, his call sign was simple and direct: Mr. Lindbergh. Lindbergh patiently explained the physics behind the technique in a way that helped the pilots understand precisely why it worked. Aircraft engines, he detailed, produce power by burning fuel to create pressure that drives the pistons. The amount of fuel burned per unit of time determines the fuel consumption. The ultimate goal is to maximize efficiency, to produce the most power for the least amount of fuel. The traditional high RPM cruise settings produced plenty of power, but they wasted fuel because the engine was cycling so rapidly, burning fuel unnecessarily. By reducing the RPM and increasing the manifold pressure, the same amount of power could be produced with fewer combustion cycles, with each cycle using the fuel more efficiently. The lean mixture setting further improved this efficiency by providing just enough fuel for complete combustion, eliminating the excess fuel used in auto-rich mode for engine cooling at high power settings. The engines did not detonate because the power setting, though over square by ratio, was not actually a high-power operation. A manifold pressure of 30 inches was moderate, well below the 60-inch war emergency power settings used for takeoff and combat. In fact, the lower RPM actually reduced the mechanical stress on the engine components. The technique was not dangerous. It was simply different from what the pilots had been taught. Lindbergh's expertise was born from years of hard-won experience with long-range flight. His 1927 Atlantic crossing had taught him the invaluable lesson that published specifications were merely starting points, not absolute limits. His work with Pan American Airways in the 1930s, surveying trans-Pacific and transatlantic routes, had given him thousands of hours to experiment with and perfect his fuel management techniques. The P-38 itself had an inherent advantage that made this experimentation less risky than it might have seemed: its twin engines. If one engine suffered damage from the experimental cruise technique, the other engine could still bring the pilot home. Over the vast, unforgiving Pacific, where a mechanical failure meant certain death by drowning or capture by the Japanese, most pilots in single-engine fighters flew conservatively. But the P-38's redundancy created a crucial margin of safety for exploring the operational envelope, and Lindbergh knew from the supply situation that the risk was acceptable. Allison was shipping spare V1710 engines and parts to the Pacific in generous quantities. If an engine needed to be replaced after experimental operation, the ground crews could install a fresh power plant quickly. The immense operational advantage of extended range more than justified accepting a small, calculated risk of increased engine wear, and the calculation proved to be correct. Not a single P-38 engine failed due to Lindbergh's cruise techniques. By late July 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control methods were spreading like a beneficial virus throughout the 5th Air Force's P-38 units. The incredible success of the 475th Fighter Group was simply impossible to ignore. Word spread to other squadrons. Pilots talked. Ground crews compared fuel consumption data. Other commanders coveted the same operational advantage that Satan's angels now enjoyed. Lindbergh gave additional presentations to pilots from other units, patiently explaining the technique, answering technical questions, and addressing their concerns about engine safety. The adoption was not immediate or universal, but it was steady and inexorable. The 28th of July, 1944, brought Lindbergh's most dramatic and defining moment with the 475th. The mission was a bomber escort to the Ceram area, flying with the 433rd Squadron. Lindbergh was flying as Blue 3 in a four-ship flight over El Paputi Bay when Blue Flight encountered enemy aircraft. Two Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonyas, Japanese light bombers used for reconnaissance and ground attack, were returning from a search for a missing comrade. The Sonyas belonged to the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai. One was piloted by the unit's commanding officer, Captain Saburo Shimada, and the other by Sergeant Yokogi. The American fighters pounced. The Sonyas were hopelessly outmatched, slower, less maneuverable, and lightly armed compared to the formidable Lightnings. They should have been easy kills, but Shimada was an experienced and wily pilot who had no intention of dying easily. The engagement rapidly devolved into a running, desperate battle. P-38s from the 9th Fighter Squadron had found the Sonyas first and were already engaged when McDonald's flight arrived on the scene. Shimada's wingman, Sergeant Yokogi, was hit by cannon fire from Lieutenant Wade Lewis, and the Sonya's left wing erupted in flames. As the enemy aircraft straightened out to run for its life, Lieutenant J.C. Haslip slipped in behind it and fired a long, punishing burst. The stricken Sonya trailed a thick plume of smoke as it dove into the sea. Shimada's Sonya, however, continued the fight. For a full 30 minutes, the Japanese captain masterfully outmaneuvered multiple attacking P-38s. He threw his aircraft into violent banks, his wingtips streaming condensation, as he racked the Sonya through maximum rate turns. The P-38 pilots tried to pull lead on the elusive target, but they just couldn't hold the aim point. The slower Japanese aircraft could turn inside the faster American fighters. Captain Danforth Miller, McDonald's wingman, managed to briefly get the Sonya in his gun sight, but he lost track of it as Shimada completed a hard left turn. Miller's tracers fell a good 80 feet behind his target. Then Shimada did something completely unexpected. Rather than continuing his evasive maneuvers, he turned directly toward the approaching Lindbergh. The two aircraft hurtled at each other head-on, their closing speed a terrifying nearly 500 mph. For Lindbergh, a man who had flown thousands of hours but had never before faced an enemy aircraft actively trying to kill him, the moment crystallized with a terrible, stark clarity. Shimada held his course. Whether he was attempting a ramming attack or simply hoping to exchange fire head-on, the Japanese captain was committed to a collision course. Lindbergh instinctively centered his sights on the Sonya's radial engine and squeezed his trigger. The P-38's formidable armament, one 20mm cannon, and four 50 caliber machine guns concentrated in the nose, erupted for 6 long seconds. Lindbergh held the trigger down. A torrent of bullets and shells slammed into the front of the Sonya. The Mitsubishi's propeller visibly slowed. Smoke began to pour from the engine, but Shimada still held his course. At the very last possible moment, Lindbergh pulled up violently, his P-38 passing over the damaged Sonya with only feet to spare. Shimada's aircraft went into a steep terminal dive. Other P-38s fired additional bursts into the falling plane. The Sonya continued its dive, trailing smoke until it hit the ocean at high speed. A fountain of white spray marked the point of impact. Foam spread in concentric circles on the water's surface, and then the waves merged back into the sea. The surface was as it had been before. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were dead. Back at the base, the question of who should get credit for the kill was discussed. Multiple pilots had hit the Sonya. McDonald, Miller, and Lindbergh had all scored hits, but it was Lindbergh's head-on burst that had mortally wounded the aircraft, slowing its propeller and starting the fatal dive. Unofficially, the pilots came to a consensus. Lindbergh had scored his first and only kill. The victory, however, was never entered into the 475th's official war record. Lindbergh was, after all, a civilian. His participation in combat was already highly irregular. Recording an official kill would undoubtedly raise questions that might put an end to his valuable time with the unit. 3 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh nearly died. The mission was a fighter sweep to the Palau Islands, where the flight encountered a swarm of Japanese Zeros. In the ensuing dogfight, Lindbergh found himself locked in a turning fight with a Zero pilot who very nearly shot him down. Only MacDonald's timely intervention, his urgent call of break right, followed by his own engagement of the Zero, saved Lindbergh's life. This close call convinced the 5th Air Force headquarters that enough was enough. Lindbergh had proven that his techniques worked. He had flown approximately 50 combat missions across his entire Pacific service, including about 25 P-38 missions with the 475th. He had shot down an enemy aircraft. He had nearly been killed. It was time to send him back to the United States before something went irreversibly wrong. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh left Hollandia to return home. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group gathered to see him off. Their respect for the civilian technical representative was deep and genuine. He had not just taught them techniques that dramatically extended their combat radius. He had flown with them, fought with them, and proven himself in an arena where rank and fame meant absolutely nothing. The impact of Lindbergh's fuel efficiency techniques extended far beyond the 475th Fighter Group. By October 1944, P-38 units throughout the Pacific were using variations of his cruise control settings. The specific numbers varied slightly between units and conditions, but the underlying principle was universal: lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, and a leaner mixture, all combining to extend range dramatically. The operational implications were profound. Targets that had once been unreachable were now accessible. Japanese bases that had previously enjoyed immunity from fighter escorts now faced P-38s that arrived with enough fuel to fight over the target and return home safely. This extended range allowed fighters to escort bombers on missions that had previously been flown unescorted, or in some cases, not flown at all. Long-range fighter sweeps could now penetrate deeper into Japanese-held territory. The P-38 groups in Dutch New Guinea were soon flying 950 miles to their targets, fighting for 15 minutes, and then returning to base. Such missions had been utterly impossible before Lindbergh's techniques became standard practice. This range extension was far from trivial. In the second half of 1944, the increased combat radius enabled operations that directly supported General MacArthur's relentless advance toward the Philippines. Airfields that could not have been supported by existing fighter ranges became viable forward bases. Invasion plans that had previously required waiting for the capture of closer airfields could now proceed much more quickly. The strategic impact was measured not just in miles, but in time. Operations that would have taken months were now completed in weeks, all because fighter cover could reach farther, faster. The technique also saved lives. Pilots who had previously returned to base with their fuel gauges on empty now had reserves for emergencies. Bad weather that forced detours no longer meant the certain loss of an aircraft. Pilots who sustained damage in combat had a much better chance of reaching home. These fuel reserves provided a vital safety margin that directly reduced combat losses from non-combat causes. The extended range proved to be especially valuable during the liberation of the Philippines. When MacArthur's forces invaded Leyte in October 1944, P-38s flying from bases in New Guinea and Morotai provided essential fighter cover over distances that had been impossible just months earlier. The difference between reaching the target with no fuel reserves and reaching it with an hour of fuel to spare was the difference between providing effective cover and merely showing up. Yet the adoption of these techniques was not without its controversy. Some commanders initially resisted, voicing concerns about engine reliability. Some pilots remained skeptical, trusting their ingrained training more than a civilian's advice. Some maintenance officers worried about the potential for increased wear on the engines. But the evidence was simply undeniable. Units that used Lindbergh's techniques reported no increase in engine failures. Fuel consumption data showed dramatic and consistent improvements. Mission reports documented successful operations that had been utterly impossible before. By late 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control technique was officially incorporated into P-38 operating procedures. What had begun as a civilian technical representative's observation had now become standard doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces published updated cruise control charts for the P-38 that reflected Lindbergh's discoveries. Pilot training materials were revised to include proper lean-of-peak mixture operation. The broader story of Lindbergh's Pacific service reveals a man driven by complex and powerful motivations. His pre-war isolationism had made him a deeply controversial figure. His comments about aviation technology in Nazi Germany had earned him accusations of being a Nazi sympathizer. His public opposition to American entry into World War II had destroyed his relationship with President Roosevelt. When war finally came, Lindbergh found himself a pariah, despite being one of America's most accomplished and knowledgeable aviators. But in the Pacific theater, far from the toxic politics of Washington, Lindbergh found a form of redemption through sheer technical competence. The Marine and Army Air Force pilots who flew with him judged him not on his political positions, but on his flying skill and his courage. Major Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, achieved while serving with V Fighter Command Headquarters and various units across the theater, told a United Press reporter that Lindbergh was as hot a pilot as any of us. He would have been out there knocking off Japs every day if General Kenny had let him. An assessment from someone of Bong's caliber meant more than any political rehabilitation ever could have. Lindbergh had proven himself where proof mattered most, in combat. After returning to the United States in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh continued his technical contributions to the war effort. In October 1944, he participated in a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter aircraft performance at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland. He flew and evaluated captured Japanese aircraft, providing invaluable insights into enemy capabilities. He continued consulting for United Aircraft and other manufacturers, troubleshooting complex problems that arose in combat operations. The technical specifications of what Lindbergh accomplished reveal the sheer magnitude of the improvement. The P-38J Lightning had an internal fuel capacity of 410 gallons in its standard tanks, two 90-gallon mains, two 60-gallon reserves, and two 55-gallon leading-edge tanks, with provisions for external drop tanks. The total capacity could exceed 1,000 gallons. At standard cruise settings of 2,200 RPM and an auto-rich mixture, fuel consumption varied by source, but was significantly higher than Lindbergh's method. Lindbergh's technique reduced consumption to approximately 70 gallons per hour in total. The combat radius increased from approximately 570 miles to 750 miles, with the same combat and reserve allowances, representing a staggering 31% improvement. For missions requiring maximum range, additional drop tanks combined with these cruise techniques achieved flights that approached 9 hours, covering over 1,000 miles. These capabilities utterly transformed Pacific operations. The strategic island-hopping campaign that characterized MacArthur's advance through New Guinea and into the Philippines relied heavily on achieving air superiority at each stage. Fighter range determined which islands could be bypassed and which required a direct and bloody assault to provide forward airfields. By extending fighter range, Lindbergh's techniques allowed for bolder and more efficient operational planning. Islands that would have required costly amphibious assaults could now be bypassed because fighters could reach their targets from more distant bases. Some historians have incorrectly attributed Lindbergh's range extension techniques to the April 1943 mission that intercepted and shot down Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport aircraft. While that mission, flown by P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron based at Guadalcanal, did push the Lightning's range to its absolute limits, Lindbergh had absolutely nothing to do with it. He did not arrive in the Pacific theater until more than a year later. What Lindbergh contributed was the crucial step of making such extreme-range missions routine rather than exceptional, death-defying feats. The human element of Lindbergh's achievement deserves special emphasis. He was 42 years old when he deployed to the Pacific, flying combat missions against pilots who were 20 years his junior. The immense physical demands of high-G maneuvering, the incredible stress of combat, the sheer discomfort of 7 to 9 hour flights in a cramped cockpit, all of it took its toll. But Lindbergh never once asked for special treatment. He flew the same missions, faced the same dangers, and followed the same procedures as the young lieutenants and captains who made up the bulk of the 475th. His willingness to prove his techniques through personal demonstration was absolutely crucial to their acceptance. If he had simply lectured about fuel management from the safety of headquarters, the pilots would have dismissed him as just another theorist who didn't understand the harsh realities of combat. By flying the missions himself and consistently proving that his techniques worked, he earned a level of credibility that no amount of rank or fame could ever have provided. The psychological impact of Lindbergh's success extended well beyond fuel management. He demonstrated that civilian technical expertise had immense value in combat operations. Military organizations naturally privilege rank and combat experience. But complex modern warfare required a level of technical sophistication that often resided outside the military chain of command. Lindbergh proved that civilians with specialized knowledge could contribute meaningfully to combat effectiveness if they were simply given the opportunity. His success encouraged military commanders to listen more closely to the civilian technical representatives from aircraft manufacturers, engine companies, and research organizations. This improved cooperation between military users and civilian developers accelerated the pace of technical innovation throughout the rest of the war. The P-38 Lightning itself deserves recognition as the aircraft that enabled Lindbergh's techniques. Its twin-engine configuration provided the redundancy that made experimentation safer. The Allison V-1710 engines, while often criticized for various problems, responded exceptionally well to careful mixture management. The P-38's complex fuel system, with its multiple tanks and transfer pumps, allowed pilots to manage their fuel with meticulous care. The aircraft's inherent stability made it well suited for long-duration cruise flight. By late 1944 and early 1945, the P-38 was being replaced in some theaters by the P-51 Mustang, which offered better performance at high altitude and longer range with the same fuel load. But in the Pacific, the P-38 remained an invaluable asset throughout the war. Its twin engines provided a crucial safety margin over the vast stretches of water. Its heavy armament delivered devastating firepower. Its maneuverability at low to medium altitudes suited the Pacific combat conditions perfectly, and its range, especially when flown using Lindbergh's techniques, remained exceptional. The final statistics tell the story. The 475th Fighter Group, flying P-38s exclusively, achieved 551 aerial victories, making it the top P-38 unit of the war. America's second-highest scoring ace, Major Thomas Maguire with 38 victories, flew P-38s with the 475th. The aircraft's potent combination of range, firepower, and reliability made it the dominant fighter in the theater, and the extended range that Lindbergh's techniques provided enhanced every single aspect of P-38 operations. Missions could reach farther, fight longer, and return safer. The cumulative impact, over thousands of sorties and hundreds of thousands of flight hours, was immeasurable but undeniably real. The story also highlights the sometimes uncomfortable relationship between expertise and institutions. Lindbergh's pre-war political positions had made him unwelcome in official military service. President Roosevelt's personal animosity prevented Lindbergh from serving in uniform. Yet the Army Air Force desperately needed the exact expertise that Lindbergh possessed. The solution, an unofficial civilian status with informal authorization to participate in combat, was highly irregular and would likely violate modern regulations. But it worked. Institutional rigidity gave way to operational pragmatism, and the result benefited the war effort immeasurably. The men who flew with Lindbergh in 1944 never forgot what he taught them. In interviews conducted decades later, former 475th pilots spoke with profound respect about the civilian who had flown as their equal and had taught them to fly farther than they ever thought possible. Colonel Warren Lewis, who commanded the 432nd Squadron, recalled Lindbergh's fuel-saving settings with precise detail decades later. While the specifics varied slightly in different accounts, reflecting adaptations to different conditions and aircraft models, the principle was universal, and the results were undeniable. Charles Augustus Lindbergh died on August 26, 1974, at the age of 72 from lymphoma at his home in Kipahulu, Maui. He had secretly left Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York on August 17, arriving in Maui just 1 week before his death. He was buried about 3 hours after his passing in a simple, handmade coffin built by Hawaiian ranch cowboys wearing their work clothes, in a grave 30 feet deep lined with lava rock and black beach pebbles at the Palapala Ho'omau Church Cemetery. Only 15 people attended the ceremony. The grave marker is a simple concrete slab, inscribed with an epitaph from Psalm 139. "If I take the wings of the morning, and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." His wartime journals, published in 1970, provided detailed and fascinating accounts of his Pacific service, including his transformative time with the 475th. The legacy of Lindbergh's Pacific service extends far beyond the specific techniques he taught. He demonstrated principles that remain profoundly relevant today. Technical expertise matters in combat operations. Civilian specialists can contribute meaningfully if they are given the opportunity. Institutional procedures should be questioned and improved when evidence supports change. Personal demonstration is always more persuasive than abstract argument. And perhaps most importantly, there is always room for improvement, even in systems that seem fully developed. In the final analysis, Lindbergh's achievement in the Pacific represents a unique intersection of specialized expertise and operational necessity. The Pacific theater demanded extreme range from its fighters. Existing procedures limited that range well below what the aircraft was technically capable of achieving. Lindbergh possessed a unique, encyclopedic knowledge of fuel management, born from a focus on efficiency that spanned decades. He was given the opportunity to apply that expertise in combat conditions, where the results could be measured objectively. He had the courage to demonstrate his techniques personally, risking his own life to prove his theories. And he had the humility to work with the pilots as an equal, rather than demanding recognition for his fame. The story of the German prisoners of war witnessing America's industrial might showed a psychological transformation through overwhelming material evidence. Lindbergh's story shows a technical transformation through demonstrated expertise. Both reveal that sometimes the greatest victories come not through brute force, but through knowledge applied with precision and proven through example. The German prisoners returned home knowing that democratic prosperity could create an astonishing abundance. The American fighter pilots who learned from Lindbergh gained techniques that multiplied their operational effectiveness while bringing them home safely. The P-38 Lightning flew on until the war's end, its distinctive twin-boom silhouette a powerful symbol of American air power in the Pacific. The pilots who flew it remember the aircraft with a deep affection, despite its quirks and challenges. And those who flew it in 1944 and after remember also the civilian who taught them that the impossible was merely difficult, that published limits were starting points, not boundaries, and that true understanding could unlock capabilities hidden in plain sight. That is Lindbergh's true Pacific legacy. Not the combat victories or the missions flown, but the knowledge shared and the techniques taught. He came as an observer and left as a teacher. He arrived as a celebrity and departed as a comrade, and he transformed an aircraft's capabilities through nothing more than understanding how it truly worked and having the courage to prove that better methods existed. The pilots of Satan's Angels knew what Lindbergh had given them. They flew farther, fought longer, and returned safer, because of knowledge shared freely by a civilian who understood fuel efficiency better than anyone else in the Pacific. That knowledge, proven in the crucible of combat and adopted throughout the theater, represents one of the most successful technical innovations of the Pacific Air War. And it came not from laboratories or engineering departments, but from one man's specialized mastery of an art he had perfected 17 years earlier, high above the Atlantic Ocean. That mastery, applied in a different context with different aircraft, proved to be as valuable in 1944 as it had been in 1927. The principle remained constant: understand the aircraft completely, manage resources with absolute precision, and never, ever accept that published limits are real limits. Lindbergh lived that principle, and for 6 weeks in the summer of 1944, he taught it to some of the finest fighter pilots in the Pacific, who in turn taught it to others, spreading the knowledge that changed how America fought the air war in the Pacific.